Look, I was never really the type to mingle much with neighbors, but when I saw that house across the street finally occupied after being empty for so long, I couldn't resist. It felt like a good chance to do something different, make a good impression on the new neighbors, and, who knows, maybe even start things off on the right foot with them. I had a few friends who would come to my house over now and then, so I thought it would be a great idea to invite everyone over for a little welcome dinner for the new neighbors. Just something simple, some snacks, drinks. Me and my friends set everything up and waited for the new couple, young, friendly, laid back, to arrive. When they showed up, they introduced themselves, mentioned they loved a good gathering, and everything seemed normal, even exciting. The dinner itself was great, you know? Everyone was laughing, talking, chatting about the neighborhood, giving tips on how things worked around here. The couple seemed super interested and even made some jokes about the neighboring houses, like they'd been around for years. I found it funny how they fit in, almost like they were already part of our routine. But halfway through the night, I noticed something odd. The guy, specifically, started messing around with his phone, looking kind of anxious. After a while, he apologized, saying he'd forgotten something important and needed to leave urgently. His wife looked a bit embarrassed but didn't really explain much either. She just apologized and followed him out the door. I felt a little confused but figured it must be something personal, so we just carried on with the night without thinking too much of it. The next morning, I woke up early, and as soon as I stepped out to grab the newspaper, I noticed something strange going on in front of their house. There was a moving truck parked there, and some guys in uniform were carrying boxes out. I was kind of surprised, right? It seemed way too soon for someone to be moving out, especially considering they just moved in, from what they told us. I figured maybe they just decided to replace some furniture or something. But curiosity got the better of me, so I walked over and casually asked one of the movers if they were doing some remodeling or something like that. That's when he looked at me with this confused expression and said no one had moved into that house recently. They were just emptying the place because of an order from the owner. I stood there, speechless, trying to process what the guy had just told me. What did he mean no one had moved in? I saw the couple, talked with them. We spent hours together the night before. It all felt so real. Trying to make sense of things, I told him I'd hosted a welcome dinner for a couple who said they lived there and that they'd even left in a hurry, like something had come up. He kept giving me this weird look, like I was making things up. In the end, he just said they were following orders and that the house had been empty for months, just waiting for a buyer. I said goodbye, still not understanding anything, and walked back home, trying to process everything. I was getting more and more uneasy. That conversation just wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to reach out to my friends who'd been at the dinner to see if they remembered the couple and to make sure I wasn't losing it. Everyone confirmed it. They'd all seen and talked with the couple the entire night. We even joked around, saying maybe the new neighbors were the overly social type to already want to move again. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. That's when I had the idea to check the photos from the dinner, just to see if we weren't imagining things. I'd taken 5 or 6 photos during the night, capturing the table, the plates, and even the couple to record the moment, you know? But when I opened the photos, a chill ran down my spine. The photos were there, just like I remembered, but something was horribly wrong. In every picture, it was just me and my friends, as if we'd been sitting there talking to empty chairs. The seats where the couple should have been were completely empty. I zoomed in on every corner, checked every detail, but there wasn't a single trace of them. It was like they'd never been there. My friends were speechless, just staring at the phone screen with the same stunned expression I had. One of them even tried to laugh, saying maybe it was a bad prank, but no one really managed to laugh. The room felt heavy, and a real sense of fear set in. A feeling that something was deeply wrong, and I couldn't explain it. After that, we sat there for a while, in silence, trying to make sense of it. None of us could come up with a logical explanation, but no one had the courage to admit just how terrifying it was. The last thing any of us wanted was to believe something supernatural was going on, but the evidence was right there. I tried to recall every detail of the previous night, every word they'd said, the way they acted, and the more I thought about it, the stranger everything seemed. I realized that, despite talking to them for hours, I didn't know anything concrete about them. Not their last name, not where they came from, and even during the conversations, everything they said felt a bit vague. like they were avoiding any personal details. That's when it started really getting to me. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy, constantly looking out the living room window at their house, hoping to see some sign of movement. But the house stayed empty, as if no one had ever lived there. Later that night, one of my friends messaged me, saying he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, that something about the couple's expressions seemed off now that he was thinking about it more. That message just made me feel worse. The image of them wouldn't leave my mind. Those smiles that seemed friendly at the time now felt strange, like they were hiding something we didn't catch. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to stick to my routine, but everything felt out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like somehow, the mystery of that night was still lingering around me. That's when I got the idea to ask some of the older neighbors if they knew anything about the couple. Maybe I was overreacting, but I needed some kind of explanation. I went next door and spoke with the lady who'd lived there for years. I casually asked if she'd seen anyone move into the house across the street. She looked at me, confused, and said no, that no one had even gone in there for months. I insisted, telling her I'd hosted a welcome dinner for a couple who said they lived there, but she just laughed, a bit awkwardly, and said I must have dreamed it or mixed it up with another house. I went back home even more confused and unsettled. I thought about calling someone else, but by then it was starting to feel like an obsession. As much as I tried to forget it, everything was still so clear in my mind. That night, alone in my house, I had the urge to look at my phone again. I opened the photos and just stared at those empty chairs. It was proof that something was wrong, but at the same time, it didn't prove anything to anyone but me and my friends. I sat there, studying each image, hoping to find some shadow, some detail we'd missed. But the more I looked, the more it seemed like the dinner had been normal, except for those empty chairs, as if the couple had never existed. After a while, my friends started avoiding the topic, but I couldn't let it go. The whole thing had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. It was like the dinner, the conversations, everything had been some sort of trap. I even started avoiding looking at their house, which stayed closed, no sign of life. In my mind, I kept wondering if I was becoming obsessed, if it was all in my head. But every time I tried to move past it, I'd find myself replaying every moment of that night, every vague word the couple had said. I'd remember their rushed excuse to leave at the end of the night, the way they disappeared into the dark, just like that. Over time, I noticed the few neighbors who knew about the story were starting to look at me differently, like I was making things up. Even my friends, who'd been just as freaked out as I was, started saying maybe we'd just misread everything. And honestly, I wanted to believe that too. But the last time I looked at those photos, the fear came back stronger. The empty chairs, us sitting there, talking and laughing with no one, that image was burned into my mind. It felt like I couldn't escape the sense that something very strange had happened. After a few days, I decided I needed some kind of closure, so I made up my mind to go to their house. Even though I knew it was empty, part of me wanted one last confirmation that no one was really living there. I walked up to the front door and knocked, almost hoping someone would answer, maybe even laugh, saying it had all been some huge misunderstanding. But of course, no one came. The door was locked, and the windows were covered in dust, like no one had touched them for months. In that moment, a strange feeling crept over me, like the house itself was watching me. There was this heavy silence, like something was telling me I shouldn't be there. Since then, I've never seen or heard nothing about that couple again. When my son called me saying his roommate hadn't come home in weeks, I have to admit I initially thought it was just one of his quirks. The guy was a bit strange, the kind who would sit quietly in a corner, rarely spoke, and only showed up occasionally, like he preferred to be invisible. My son always mentioned that he would disappear without explanation, sometimes for days, only to reappear as if nothing had happened. But this time felt different. He had been missing for over a week, and no one had heard from him. The atmosphere in the apartment was already tense. My son was uneasy, and I figured it was time for me to go over and help out. I arrived in the late afternoon, and the apartment had this weird vibe, like everything had frozen in time. His things were scattered around, but it looked like he had just stepped out for a quick errand and would be back any minute. The problem was, the more we looked around, the more we found details that didn't add up. I found a pile of receipts for random purchases, things in quantities that seemed way too high for such a small apartment, like cleaning supplies in bulk and weird tools. My son said his roommate was reserved, but he had never seen anything like that before. It was as if he had tried to hide something. At that point, I started to feel a strange chill, but I tried not to show it. After all, it could just be my paranoia, right? After a while of rummaging through the place, we began to feel uneasy. I was there in what should have been just an apartment, but it felt different. Each drawer we opened seemed to lead to a bigger mystery. In a closet in his room, we found a backpack filled with bizarre stuff. Rolls of tape, plastic bags, and even some brand new gloves. Sure, there could be an explanation, but the amount of stuff was starting to freak me out. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to think, but neither of us wanted to say out loud what was crossing our minds. It was just too strange. That's when my son suggested looking up his name online to see if we could find any information or maybe discover where he had gone. With just a few clicks, we found a recent news article, and that's when the shock hit us. He had been arrested. It wasn't anything minor. It was serious stuff, the kind of crimes you only see in horror movies. I felt my blood run cold at that moment. My son stood there, staring at the laptop screen, and silence filled the room. It was like the reality hit us all at once. We were in that apartment, where he likely brought and hid evidence, and now it was too late to pretend we didn't know anything. After that discovery, I just wanted to leave, but my son insisted we stay a bit longer and search through everything. He seemed in shock, and I knew that was his way of processing it. We headed to the roommate's bedroom, and that's when the worst part began. In the back of a drawer, we found a locked box, but for some reason, the key was nearby, sitting in a mug. I don't think either of us thought twice before opening it. Inside were several strange photos of empty places, like an abandoned warehouse and dark hallways, locations I didn't even know existed around here. Some images showed odd details, like stains on the floor and walls with marks, which made me want to drop everything and leave. Each new find seemed to confirm my worst fears. In the last drawer, tucked under some papers, we found a knife, one of those big hunting ones. It had some dark stains on it, and I didn't even want to think about what they could be. My son looked pale, and I had to resist the urge to just grab him and run out of there. I started imagining how many times he had been there alone with this guy, sleeping in the next room, completely unaware of who he really was. It was terrifying to think about how much we cannot know a person, even someone we're close to, and what they might be doing when they disappear for days. From that point on, everything started to feel like a crime scene to me. Every object, every detail, I saw as a clue to something bigger and scarier than I could imagine. My son and I were silent, just processing it all. The whole situation was turning into a real-life nightmare, the kind you can't wake up from. Then I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. There were marks on the carpet, small but noticeable, as if something heavy had been dragged from there out into the hallway. I never thought I would say this, but at that moment, I didn't want to know what he had taken or what might have been hidden there before he vanished. While my son kept looking around, I felt a suffocating sensation, like the air was too thick to breathe. I didn't know what to do anymore. Part of me wanted to call the police right then and there, but everything felt complicated. What if we got caught up in it somehow? I just wanted to get my son out of that situation as quickly as possible. I told him it was time to leave, that there was nothing left to discover there. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a true look of fear on his face. Without saying another word, he grabbed his things and followed me to the door. Leaving that apartment felt like the only right thing to do. As we stepped out of the building, it felt like the tension was still clinging to me. I don't think either my son or I said much on the way to the car, but it was like we were both trying to process everything, the strange details we had found. But the worst was still to come. In the middle of the night, already home, I received a call from the police. I can't explain the chill that ran down my spine when I saw the unknown number. They wanted to know if I had any information about my son's roommate, if he had left anything suspicious behind or mentioned anything that could help with their investigation. It was like every discovery from that day came rushing back, becoming even more real. What was weird was that they seemed to already know some things, as if they had a lead on what to look for. They asked a ton of questions about the apartment, the items we found, and at one point, They specifically asked about the knife. I had no idea how they knew about it, but my mind started racing, trying to figure out just how far that guy had gone and what he had left behind. After the call, I looked at my son and saw that he was just as shaken as I was. The reality hit hard. He had been sharing a space with someone capable of things that we wouldn't even dream of in nightmares. It was hard to digest how close he had been to real danger without ever realizing it. In the following weeks, we learned that the police actually found evidence in that apartment, things I preferred not to ask my son about, and he didn't want to tell me. It was like we had made a silent agreement never to speak of it again. The truth is, I don't know if I can handle the thought of how close he was to a real threat, and I'll never understand how someone can hide such darkness. I find myself wondering how many times he crossed paths with that roommate, how many casual conversations they had without ever knowing the monster lurking right next to them. And in the end, I guess we'll never know how well we truly know someone. It was an ordinary weekend, and my family and I decided to go hiking at a campsite we had always frequented. The place was beautiful, surrounded by tall trees and a clear blue sky. We were excited to enjoy nature, breathe fresh air, and escape our routine. As soon as we started walking, everything seemed normal, but there was a strange feeling in the air, like something was about to happen. As we followed the trail, I noticed that some people who usually were there were missing, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a matter of luck. After a while, we came across a guy who introduced himself as a park ranger. He was wearing a uniform, but something about the way he acted didn't feel right. It was a mix of excessive friendliness and a stare that never wavered from us. He asked if we needed help, and even though I was hesitant, my wife and the kids were confident and ended up convincing me to accept the ranger's help. The man told us he knew the area well and could take us on the most beautiful path. At that moment, I thought he was just trying to be helpful, but as we continued, I began to realize we were straying further from the main path. As we moved along, the ranger began to lead us down narrower and darker trails. It was as if he was guiding us away from where we should be. My gut was screaming at me to stay alert. I started asking about the things I saw around us, trying to change the subject, but he always circled back to how dangerous the place was without proper guidance. I could feel my anxiety growing, and when I suggested we turn back to the main trail, he simply smiled and said we were close to a really beautiful, secluded spot. His smile seemed more forced with every word. With each step, the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked at my wife and the kids, trying to gauge if they were sensing the same thing I was. They seemed a bit comfortable, which made me even more uneasy. The ranger kept guiding us, and when we tried to pull away, he immediately followed, insisting he show us an incredible view just ahead. It was strange, and the atmosphere that had once been cheerful and relaxing was turning into something dark and oppressive. I looked back and realized the path we had taken was getting further and further away, as if we were being pulled into an unknown place. The tension in my chest only grew. My instincts were screaming for me to get away from him, but the kids were happy, looking at the trees and commenting on the birds. I tried to hide my concern, but when I finally looked at the man following us, I saw something in his gaze that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just an innocent interest in helping us. It was as if he were studying our reactions, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I needed to act. I had to do something. I looked around, trying to find a way out of the situation, and I realized the trail was becoming narrower, as if the forest was closing in on us. With my heart racing, I tried to pull my family back, but the ranger was already at our side, insisting we keep going. The tone of his voice had changed. It was no longer friendly. There was a strange urgency in his words. "We're almost there," he said, but something told me that the direction we were heading wasn't right. The fear was palpable, and the trees seemed to close in on us, as if they wanted to trap us. With each moment, I felt more cornered, and the kids, sensing my change in behavior, started to get restless. Adrenaline kicked in. I decided it was time to leave that trail, no matter what he said. I called my wife and told her we were going back. The ranger was momentarily taken aback, but quickly recovered and tried to block our way. His gaze was fixed and threatening, as if he wasn't willing to let us go so easily. My stomach churned. There was a dark force in those eyes that I would never forget. We forced our way past him, trying to ignore his insistence, but the more we distanced ourselves, the more he insisted on following. The forest felt alive, every sound echoing as if it were laughing at our predicament. We ran, even though the kids were starting to cry. The ranger was behind us, calling out, trying to calm us, but it was a trap. That man, who had presented himself as a protector, was now becoming our pursuer. Finally, spotting a clearing, we managed to pick up the pace, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. We entered the clearing and, before we could breathe a sigh of relief, looked back. The ranger had stopped a distance away, watching, with a sinister smile on his face. I never knew how he fell away from us, or why he didn't keep following. It was as if the forest had decided to let us go. We ran to the car, and when we got there, I looked back one last time, but he was gone. It was like he had disappeared. From that day on, trails and woods became places I could never see the same way again. What was supposed to be a fun outing turned into a nightmare etched in my memory. I feel like, somehow, we escaped something terrible, but I still don't know exactly what it was. The tension in my chest only grew. My instinct screamed at me to get away from him, but the kids were happy, looking at the trees and commenting on the passing birds. I tried to hide my worry, but when I finally glanced at the man following us, I felt a chill down my spine. It wasn't just innocent interest in helping us. It felt like he was studying our reactions, waiting for the right moment to act. I needed to do something. I looked around, trying to find a way out, and noticed the trail getting narrower, as if the forest was closing in on us, each step taking us further away from what we knew. With my heart racing, I tried to pull my family back, but the guard was already beside us, insisting we keep going. His tone had changed. It was no longer friendly. There was a strange urgency in his words. "We're almost there," he said, but something told me we were heading in the wrong direction. The fear was palpable, and the trees seemed to lean in, as if forming a prison around us. With every moment, I felt more trapped, and the kids, sensing my shift in behavior, began to grow restless. Adrenaline kicked in. I decided it was time to leave that trail, no matter what he said. I called my wife, my voice shaking as I told her we were turning back. The guard was momentarily surprised, but quickly recovered and tried to block our path. His fixed, threatening gaze was something I could never forget. I felt my stomach churn, as if a dark force was radiating from him, an energy that settled between us and our freedom. We forced our way past him, ignoring his insistence, but the more we moved away, the more he insisted on following, his presence becoming a nightmare we couldn't escape. The forest seemed alive, every sound echoing as if it were laughing at our misfortune. We ran, even as the kids started crying, and the guard was behind us, calling, trying to calm us, but it was a trap. That man, who presented himself as a protector, was now our pursuer. Finally, when we spotted a clearing ahead, we quickened our pace, and it felt like a weight was lifted from our shoulders. We entered the clearing, and before we could breathe a sigh of relief, we looked back. The guard had stopped at a distance, watching us with a sinister smile, like a hunter who had finally found his prey. I never knew how he fell away from us, or why he didn't keep following. It was as if the forest had decided to let us go. We ran to the car, and when we got there, I looked back one last time, but he was gone. It was like he had evaporated. Since that day, trails and woods became places I could never see the same way again. What was supposed to be a fun outing turned into a nightmare etched in my memory. I feel like, somehow, we escaped something terrible, but I still don't know exactly what it was. That night, when I got to the gas station, I already knew it was going to be a long, boring shift. Normally, it's pretty quiet in the middle of the night, so I just keep an eye on the gas pumps, organize the counter, and sometimes watch a video to pass the time. But as soon as I opened the station, I found a piece of paper right on the ground at the entrance, close to the automatic doors. It was weird because I had cleaned everything the night before and didn't remember seeing anything like that there. I picked up the note. It was crumpled and written in a hurried, almost scratchy handwriting that said, "He's coming to get what's his." I felt this strange chill down my spine, but I shook it off, figured it was just some prank by a customer trying to mess with me. I threw the note away and tried not to think about it anymore. The first few hours passed slowly, like always, until the station light started flickering out of nowhere. I watched from inside the convenience store, trying to figure out what was going on. The electricity there never fails, so I found it strange. I went to the breaker box in the back to see if there was an issue, but everything looked fine. I went back to the counter, thinking it was just some random glitch, but the place already had this weird vibe ever since I found that note. I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone, but I just kept pretending it was only fatigue and told myself that the middle of the night always makes things feel off. Not long after that, I started hearing strange noises, like creaking and footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sounds were clear, like someone was walking near the shelves. I went to check if a customer had come in, but the place was empty. I went back to the counter, trying to ignore it. Still, every time the station fell totally silent, those footsteps seemed to get closer, but they always disappeared just as suddenly. It was a faint but constant noise, like someone was there, trying not to be seen. By this point, I was getting suspicious, so I grabbed my phone and messaged a friend, just to try to distract myself. While I was trying to shake off the weird vibe, I heard the sound of paper falling behind me. I turned to look, and suddenly there was another note on the floor, right next to the drink fridge. This time, the message was shorter. It only said, "He's closer." That bad feeling came rushing back, and for a second, I just stood there, holding the note, heart pounding. How had that note ended up there? I was alone. I was sure of it. I'd checked the whole place before opening, and no one had come in since. I started to think someone was watching me, but it didn't make any sense. I tried convincing myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake that feeling that something, or someone was really getting closer. After the second note, my mind was racing. I decided to walk around the station, checking every corner to see if I could find anything or anyone. I went past the shelves, back to the storage room, looked at the security cameras, but there was nothing, no strange movement. The silence inside started to weigh on me, and it felt like the whole place was pressing down on me, like the air just before a storm. I went back to the counter, but every sound seemed amplified. Every detail felt like a warning that something worse was coming. I was trying to stay calm, but honestly, I couldn't stop looking around, expecting that at any moment something would show itself. Then, while I was straightening some products on the shelf, the door to the storage room made this loud creak, opening on its own. The noise was so loud, it echoed through the station, and I nearly dropped a bag of chips on the floor. When I looked at the door, it was slightly open, with total darkness inside. I stood there, unable to move, feeling like any step toward that door might be my last. I knew I should go check it out, but my legs felt heavy, and a part of me just wanted to run. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and went over to the storage room door to close it. As I got close, I caught a strange smell, kind of sour, that I hadn't noticed before. It was faint but unsettling, like something rotting. I peeked inside, but the darkness was so thick I couldn't see anything. I backed away slowly, trying to ignore the chill up my spine. The second I turned back to the counter, there was another note right on top of the register. I was sure it hadn't been there before, and it made my stomach twist. This note just said, "He's here." The words seemed to scream in my mind, and a wave of dread took over me. At this point, every little sound felt like a warning. Every flicker of the lights made my heart jump. I went back to the register, grabbed the note with shaking hands, and wondered if I should just get out, abandon the shift, and leave everything behind. But something kept me there, a weird curiosity mixed with fear, like I needed to understand what was happening. I sat back on the stool, trying to pretend that none of this was getting to me, but inside I was falling apart, wondering who or what might be around, watching me. The night seemed endless. After a while, the silence became unbearable, like something was about to happen any second. The lights flickered again, but this time it was different. They blinked faster, almost like they were reacting to something, and then everything went dark for a few seconds. I just stood there, frozen in total darkness, barely breathing, until the lights came back on. And that's when I saw another note, this time stuck on the glass door at the entrance. I couldn't understand how these notes kept showing up without me noticing. This last one said, "He's outside." I almost felt my legs give out because the idea of someone actually waiting outside was paralyzing. I tried to look through the glass, but the night was too dark, and even though the station lights were bright, they didn't reach very far. I opened the door slowly and peeked outside, but there was nothing except the empty road and the faint sound of the wind. I locked the door as fast as I could and went back to the counter. By now, I was convinced I had to leave. But just as I was grabbing my things to head out, I saw the last note of the night, right there on the counter, as if it was waiting for me. The final message was short and clear. "He's watching you." By now, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my stuff, left everything as it was, and headed straight for the door. My only thought was to get out of there as fast as I could. But just as I put my hand on the doorknob, I heard footsteps echoing through the station, coming from the storage room. They were slow, heavy steps, like someone or something dragging itself. I stood there, not knowing what to do, gripping the doorknob so hard my fingers started to hurt. The fear was so intense I could barely breathe. For a moment, I thought about turning around and facing whatever it was, but my survival instinct won out. I ran out the door without looking back. On my way to the car, it felt like someone was following me. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but that heavy feeling of being watched was unbearable, like something was tracking my every move. I got into the car, slammed the door, and turned the key with shaking hands. As soon as the engine started, I glanced quickly at the rearview mirror, and for an instant, I thought I saw a shadow standing near the station entrance, but I didn't have the guts to look closer. I drove away at full speed, leaving that horrible night behind, and with it, a feeling that still haunts me. The sense that something watched me until I disappeared down the road. Since that night, I've never been back to that gas station. When we decided to spend the holiday at a vacation house in the middle of nowhere, all I wanted was some peace. It had that vibe, you know? A place far from everything, with a calmness that I thought would give me a break from the daily grind. My son brought a few toys, just the essentials, so he'd have something to play with while we enjoyed some family time. On the first night, after he fell asleep, I did that basic, general cleanup, putting away everything he'd left scattered around. I left it all in a corner of the living room, thinking how nice it'd be to wake up to everything organized. But in the middle of the night, I woke up with a weird feeling. I took a quick look around the living room, and one of his toy cars was in the hallway, a bit away from the rest. I figured maybe he'd woken up and moved it, but the kid was sleeping like a rock. I put the car back and went back to bed. The next day, I noticed another toy out of place, only this time. It was in the bathroom. I thought it was just my imagination, or that my kid was wandering around the house at night without us realizing it. Still, I started feeling uneasy, like someone was messing with our stuff. I asked my wife if she'd seen our son playing alone, but she just gave me a strange look, saying he hadn't even woken up during the night. I tried not to think too much of it. After all, the house was old, with creaky floors and gaps that I figured might make objects slide around. But deep down, it was bothering me more than I wanted to admit. On the third night, I felt more alert to any sounds, almost like I was waiting for something to happen. It was a light sleep, you know? Like I was half awake the whole time. In the middle of the night, I got up to get some water and found one of my son's toys in the hallway near the front door. This time, the toy was facing the wall, as if someone had put it there on purpose. The strange thing was, I clearly remembered putting all the toys on the shelf before going to bed. I just stood there, staring at the toy in the dark, feeling a chill that made me step back and go back to the bedroom without the courage to touch it. Each night, it got more unsettling. Every day, I'd find a toy out of place, always in some random corner of the house. The next night, it was a toy car, this time in the kitchen, under the table. My wife started thinking I was overreacting, but I swear I felt something odd, a kind of discomfort that just kept growing. I even tried staying up at night to see if I could catch my son in the act, but he was always fast asleep, and that only made everything more confusing and, honestly, scarier. On the fifth night, I decided to keep the toys in our bedroom, thinking that would put an end to this feeling that something was off. I put all the toys next to our bed and lay down, trying not to overthink it. But as soon as I dozed off, I heard a faint noise from the hallway, something like the sound of soft footsteps, or maybe something being dragged. My heart was racing, and I just lay there, frozen, trying to figure out if it was real or just in my head. I finally gathered the courage to go to the door, but I didn't see anything. I went back to bed, trying to calm myself down, but the truth was, the house was feeling more and more suffocating, like there was something there we couldn't see. The next morning, I found one of my son's toys outside the house. It was one of those noisy toys, lying on the grass as if someone had taken it outside and left it there. The strange thing was that there were marks on the ground, as if something had dragged it out. I just stood there staring at it, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe some animal had taken the toy? But it didn't make sense. It was a fairly heavy toy, not something easy to carry. And the marks, it looked like someone, or something, had come out of the house. It gave me a chill, a certainty that something was wrong, something I just couldn't understand. That night, I decided to leave the hallway light on. I tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me on edge, waiting for something to move in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the noise again, closer this time, almost inside our bedroom. I got up carefully, and there, near the door, was the same toy I'd found outside earlier. It was like it had come back into the house. My heart was pounding, and the air felt heavy, like it was hard to breathe. I looked at my wife and my son, who were still sleeping deeply, and I felt paralyzed. At that moment, I was certain we weren't alone, but I couldn't see what it was. In the end, I decided to take the toy and put it in the closet, hidden behind some clothes, as if that would somehow help stop this strange feeling. But while I was putting it away, I heard quick footsteps in the hallway, like someone running. I stepped out of the room and looked around the house, too scared to turn on any lights, just using the dim glow from the hallway. I didn't find anything or anyone, but when I returned to the bedroom, I found another toy in the middle of the floor, right in the doorway, like it had been left there on purpose. The next morning, that feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole time. My wife was starting to get worried, though she didn't want to admit that she was feeling something strange, too. I decided that night would be our last there, since the holiday was ending anyway. That night, I packed all the toys into a box and locked them in the car, thinking that with them out of the house, things would finally settle down. I felt a bit silly, but at the same time, relieved. I thought I'd finally ended these little scares. But around 2 in the morning, I heard a noise outside, near the car. My whole body went cold, but at the same time, I felt like I had to check. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, not wanting to wake anyone. And that's when I saw it. On the car hood was the same toy I'd locked away. It was filthy, covered in grass and dirt, like it had been dragged back out. I felt a mix of fear and desperation, like something was playing with us, testing my limits. I left the toy there and went back inside, determined to leave at first light before anything else strange could happen. The next morning, before dawn, I woke everyone up and hurried to pack up. My wife thought I was overreacting, but I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I loaded everything into the car and took one last look at the house before closing the door. The relief of leaving that place was instant, but it wasn't completely comforting. Deep down, I knew something had messed with us during that holiday. As we drove back, I tried to push the thought away, but the memories of those nights kept creeping back. After that holiday, I put my son's toys away for a while. Even now, when I see one of those dolls, I feel uncomfortable, like I brought a piece of that place back with me. We never went back to that house, and I never found an explanation for what happened there. Sometimes, I think it was just my mind playing tricks because of the isolation, but there's always that lingering doubt. That doll, dirty with grass, still haunts my memories, a silent reminder that some things just don't have an explanation. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, unknowing what had woken me. My room was dark, with just a faint beam of light coming from the street lamp, barely lighting up the wall in front of me. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, and that's when I saw something terrifying. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or some weird light effect, but there was definitely something there. It looked like a hand, a pale and almost gray hand, coming out of the wall. I froze in the bed, with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my head. My eyes were fixed on that thing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was like the hand was trying to push something through the wall, and its fingers were moving slightly, feeling around as if searching for something. The fear paralyzed me. You know that feeling in a nightmare when you try to move but your body just doesn't respond? I was like that, totally frozen, only able to watch as the hand kept emerging inch by inch. It seemed halfway between solid and ghostly, like it was stuck in some strange boundary between my room and I don't know where. Every detail became clearer as the hand moved forward. The joints, the veins, even the nails, all in a dead, kind of see-through color. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I was completely paralyzed, just staring wide-eyed, feeling the terror growing with every little movement by that thing. As that hand kept sliding down the wall, the fear just kept building. It wasn't moving in a jerky or aggressive way, but rather incredibly slowly and carefully, like it knew exactly the effect it was having on me. The hand seemed to explore the wall with its fingers, touching it as if it was looking for something on the other side. That only made everything worse, because it wasn't just a quick apparition or some strange reflection. I could see every single movement that it did, and that gave me the feeling it was far too real, that it was actually happening right there, and I had no way to escape. At that moment, I tried to move even a single finger, to take a deeper breath, anything to show I still had some control over my body. But it was as if the presence of that hand was draining me, keeping me stuck there with no way to react. My eyes were starting to tear up from staring so long, but I didn't dare blink, too scared I might miss any part of it. The hand was almost fully out now, with its palm pressed against the wall and its fingers stretched out, slightly curled as if they were reaching for something on my side. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a feeling I'd never had before. My mind began racing in 1,000 directions, trying to make sense of what on earth was happening. I thought maybe it was some kind of sleep paralysis, but everything felt so physical. I could even hear a faint scratching sound from the nails against the wall, as if it was searching for a weak spot, a way to completely cross over to my side. The hand was moving slowly, almost studying the area around it, and it was so deliberate that I almost felt like it had its own awareness. It was like a part of someone, something, trying to reach into my world. The helplessness was overwhelming, and that only made the fear grow. Then, when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the hand stopped, suddenly freezing in mid-motion. I couldn't look away, just waiting to see what would happen next. And then I felt this strange pressure in my chest, as if something invisible was holding me down, stopping any attempt to breathe deeply. The hand wasn't moving, but I knew it knew I was there, watching it all. That pause seemed to last forever. The hand stayed there, motionless, but it radiated this overwhelming presence, like something or someone was right on the verge of fully crossing the wall. I had this crazy urge to shut my eyes, but at the same time, an irrational fear that by not watching, I'd lose some sort of control over what was happening. It was like keeping my gaze fixed on that hand was somehow stopping something worse from happening. I felt sweat running down my temples, my whole body tense, my muscles aching from the lack of movement, but I couldn't relax for even a second. Then, as if it realized I was aware of it, the hand started moving again, this time with more intention. The fingers curled a little, in a motion like it was calling me. That hit me with an immediate sense of dread, like I was the next thing it wanted to grab. Time felt distorted, with each second stretching into what felt like minutes. And at that moment, something deep inside me, maybe pure survival instinct, finally broke me free from that paralyzed state. With all the effort I could muster, I managed to move my hand and pull the blanket up, as if that might somehow protect me. The hand, though, seemed to notice my reaction. It stopped again, its fingers trembling slightly, as if frustrated or impatient. I could almost feel a presence on the other side of the wall, something trapped there but determined to come through. I curled up even tighter, trying to press myself into the bed, hoping that by staying as still as possible, it would lose interest in me. But instead of disappearing, the hand made one final move, sliding back into the wall, slowly and deliberately. The fingers faded away bit by bit, as if being sucked back into wherever they'd come from. My heart only started to beat a little slower once the very last tip of the finger vanished into the wall, but even then, I knew that wasn't the end. I lay there, frozen, staring at the spot where the hand had disappeared, trying to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare, but the cold sensation on my skin and the chills that stuck with me for the rest of the night left no room for doubt. Even after the hand was gone, I stayed there staring at the wall, too scared to move. My whole body was shaking, and the room felt colder than before, like something had drained all the energy from it. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself it was some kind of hallucination or my mind playing tricks on me in the middle of the night, but nothing seemed to make sense. The vision had been way too clear, too detailed. Every part of that hand was still etched in my mind. Every line and contour of the fingers like a memory I knew I'd never be able to erase. After a while, though I had no idea how much time had passed, I decided to turn on the light. My hands were trembling so much it took me a moment to reach the switch, but when I finally managed to, the room filled with light, pushing away the shadows that surrounded me. But to my shock, when I looked at the wall where it all happened, I noticed a faint mark, almost unnoticeable, like the fingers of that hand had left a trail behind. I moved closer, not believing what I was seeing, and ran my fingers over the mark, feeling an odd texture, like the wall had somehow been corroded in that spot. I stared at that mark on the wall for a long time, the fear coming back in full force. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt an intense urge to get out of the room, to stay away from that wall. I went back to bed and stayed there, too scared to close my eyes, every sound in the room seeming louder. Time crawled by, and the tension wouldn't let up. My heart raced at every tiny noise, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Finally, when daylight started to break, a bit of calmness washed over me, but still, every time I looked at that wall, a shiver ran down my spine. I spent the day trying to act normal, but I couldn't shake that experience from my mind. And the worst part was knowing no one would believe me if I told them. It was a lonely fear, something I'd have to carry on my own, never quite sure if it really happened, or if it might happen again. Since then, every night before I sleep, I stare at that wall and pray I never see that hand again. I was alone on the night shift, like always, when this woman ran into the station with a kid in her arms. Right away, I could see she was in full panic mode. My first thought was that there'd been an accident, so I started asking if she was okay, if she needed medical help. But before I could finish, she looked at me with this desperation I'd never seen before and said they were on the run, that a group of people was after them. You know when someone says something, and you can just feel it's serious? I could tell she wasn't messing around, though I had no clue what was really going on. I tried to calm her down and asked her to explain, but then I heard the sound of tires screeching outside, like a bunch of cars had just pulled up all at once. When I looked up, I saw 5 or 6 shadows near the gas pumps, and more people getting out of the cars. It was a big group, all standing there, dead quiet, just staring at the station. I felt a chill run up my spine, that feeling like you're about to get caught up in something way worse than you're ready for. I knew they were there for the woman and the kid, so the first thing I thought was to hide them somewhere in the station, out of sight. I took the woman and the kid to this tiny room in the back where we keep the cleaning supplies. It wasn't much, but at least it was out of view. She was clutching the kid, who looked more confused than scared, and I whispered for them to stay quiet, promising I'd try to hold off the people outside. Inside, though, I was terrified too. There was something wrong with those people. Something in the way they just stood there, staring at the entrance, not saying a word. It felt too coordinated. It didn't seem normal. I went back to the counter, trying not to show how rattled I was, and looked out the door again. Now they were closer, about 5 or 6 right up by the glass doors, staring straight at me. One of them finally came up to the door and tried to open it, and I shouted that we were closed. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me, like he was trying to figure me out, testing to see how far I'd go. I knew I wasn't going to be able to stall them for long. My heart started pounding harder, and I tried to play it cool, but it was impossible to ignore their presence outside. All with those empty expressions, not saying a word. The woman and the kid were hidden, but I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I glanced at the phone behind the counter, but this weird thought crossed my mind. What if this group had already planned ahead and someone was taking care of any outside help coming our way? It sounded crazy, but in that situation, it actually felt more reasonable than believing I was safe here. Minutes went by, and the tension kept climbing. They started moving around the station, tapping on the walls and windows, like they were looking for a weak spot. I wanted to yell, tell them to get out, but for some reason, I couldn't even move. Then I heard a noise near the back door where I'd hidden the woman and the kid. My heart nearly stopped. I tiptoed over, and when I got close, I heard her whispering to the kid to stay quiet. I headed back to the counter, trying to think of what I'd do if they tried to break in. The situation kept getting worse. They'd circled the place, and a few of them started pushing on the glass doors, testing how much pressure they could take. The eerie part was they were doing it in total silence, not a single word. I had no idea what was happening. It felt like a scene out of a nightmare, where everything moves in this creepy, unnatural way. My gut told me I just needed to buy us some time. I glanced back at the room where the woman and the kid were hiding and tried to convince myself they'd be okay. But deep down, I didn't really believe it. That's when the woman, without making a sound, peeked out from the door and gestured at me. She seemed calmer now, but there was something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. It was like she'd known this was going to happen and was just waiting for the right moment to leave. I crept over and quietly asked if she thought they were going to leave, but she just looked at me and mumbled something I couldn't quite catch in the heat of the moment. All I know is she held the kid even tighter, and the tension in her face told me this wasn't going to end well. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud crash. One of the people outside had thrown something heavy at the glass door, which cracked but, luckily, didn't shatter. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I tried to signal for them to stop, but it didn't make any difference. They were dead set on getting in, and I had no idea what they really wanted. At this point, I started to wonder who this woman even was and what she could have done to draw a group like this. So determined and, honestly, creepy. The woman then pulled the kid further back into the room, like she was bracing for the worst. I decided that if this kept up, I'd have to try calling the cops, even though I wasn't sure if the phone would work. But before I could do anything, the crack in the door started giving way, and one of the men slipped his hand through the opening, slowly pushing until he had a small gap. Then he spoke for the first time, in this low, unsettling voice. "You know you can't run." Just those words were enough to make me shake, but I kept a straight face. With that crack in the door, I knew I wasn't going to hold anything off anymore. The man's voice, cold and almost empty of emotion, echoed in my head. He kept pushing the door, making the gap wider and wider, like he wanted to remind us that they were in control. I went back to the small room and told the woman they were about to get in that we needed a plan. She just nodded, holding the kid so tight I thought she might hurt him. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes, and that struck me. If she, who'd seemed so determined before, was that scared, it meant this was serious. Right then, I heard fast footsteps, and I realized more of them had gotten out of the cars. It felt like the whole group was there now, surrounding the station on every side. I tried to think of an escape, but the only way out was the emergency door on the other side, which was in full view of them. I looked out the window again, and one of them was holding a cell phone, like he was waiting for some signal. I had this gut feeling that if they got in, no one inside would be getting out alive. I didn't know what else to do, torn between helping the woman and the kid and just wanting to save my own skin. Then, all of a sudden, everything went quiet. The footsteps, the tapping, even the heavy breathing I'd thought I'd heard from one of the guys outside. It all just stopped. I looked out the window and, to my shock, there was no one there. The whole group had vanished, like they'd evaporated into thin air in just seconds. I went to the back room and told the woman. She breathed a sigh of relief, but she didn't seem that surprised. I asked if she thought they'd really left, but she just gave me this strange look, like she'd been expecting it all along. We had planned that weekend at the cabin for months. After being buried in work for so long, my wife and I just wanted peace. It was a wooden little house in the mountains, pretty isolated, with a fireplace and an amazing view of the snow outside. The cold outside was intense, but the cabin was warm, and the idea was just to relax. The night was so quiet that we could only hear the crackling of the wood in the fireplace and the wind outside. That's when we heard the footsteps, heavy and slow, sinking into the snow and coming straight towards the door. At first, I thought it might be the cabin owner, maybe bringing more firewood or something. But the sound of those steps was strange, almost dragging. I looked at my wife, and she looked back with that look of, "You heard that too, right?" When I opened the door, what I saw made me uncomfortable. It was a tall man, wearing old clothes and completely covered in snow. He looked exhausted, and his expression was anything but welcoming. Before I could say anything, he started murmuring that he needed to come in, that the cold would take him if he didn't warm up a bit. We didn't really know what to do, but it felt cruel to leave the man outside. So, with no other option, I let him in. He walked over to the fireplace and stood there, rubbing his hands and staring at the fire, but there was something strange about the way he looked at the flame, almost like he was hypnotized. And the way he spoke. His words seemed disconnected, not making much sense, as if he were somewhere else while talking to us. His presence began to weigh heavily, and a strange chill filled the cabin. It felt like the warmth from the fireplace was having no effect, and in fact, the place seemed to get colder. I glanced at my wife, who was hugging herself, shivering a bit. The man began murmuring things that sent chills down my spine. He talked about not leaving the mountains, about becoming one with the ice, as if it were some kind of inevitable fate. That made no sense, but the way he said it, in a low voice with a vacant stare, felt like a warning, as if he was giving us a hint, yet hoping we wouldn't understand. We tried to make conversation to figure out where he was from, maybe discover if he was lost or something. I asked where he lived, what he was doing out there so late and alone in the freezing cold. He just smiled, a strange, cold smile, and turned his gaze back to the fireplace. It was then that the fire began to flicker, dying down slowly, as if someone had poured water on it. But there was no water or anything. It was just him there, sitting and rubbing his hands, with that smile that seemed to say he knew exactly what was happening. The tension in the air was thick, and my wife was becoming visibly uncomfortable. I walked over to the door with the intention of opening it, maybe suggesting to the man that he should keep moving, but the doorknob wouldn't budge. It was as if someone had locked the door from the inside, but I didn't remember turning any key. I fumbled with the latch while that tense silence grew in the room, and the man just watched, with that same frozen smile. At that moment, the cold seemed to be emanating from him, as if he carried winter in his very being. I felt a shiver run down my spine when I noticed that the air coming from my mouth formed vapor, even though we were inside the cabin. My wife, with a pale face, finally stood up and suggested we go to the bedroom. It felt like a desperate attempt to escape the situation, to put a barrier between us and him. But before we could take a step, the man turned to us, still smiling, and said slowly that no one leaves. His tone wasn't threatening. It was more like a statement, something so definite it didn't allow for a rebuttal. My heart raced, and my mind began to search for some rational explanation, but nothing made sense. The feeling of being trapped with him was suffocating. The heat from the fireplace was now practically non-existent, and the cold took over the cabin in a way I had never felt before, not even outside. I looked back at the man, and he was there, motionless, staring intently at the almost non-existent flames. His murmurs returned, and he started repeating over and over that no one ever leaves, almost like a mantra. With each repetition, his voice grew softer, but the meaning became more disturbing, as if it were a truth we were just beginning to grasp. By this point, all I wanted was for him to leave, but I had no idea how. My wife, practically frozen in fear, whispered to me that she felt something was wrong, something beyond what we could see. And I felt it too. It was as if the entire cabin had changed, transformed into a sort of trap, with that man at the center of it all. In a sudden impulse, I tried to turn on a lantern we had brought, but the light flickered and died, as if the cold were draining all the energy around us. At this point, even the idea of spending the night there felt impossible. I could only think about how to get out of that place, but the feeling of being watched by that man kept us frozen. The sensation of paralysis grew unbearable. I couldn't take my eyes off him, as if he had some control over us just with his presence. It was a terror I had never felt before, a primal fear of having nowhere to run or how to escape. The weirdest thing was that the cold seemed to be growing in waves, stronger and stronger, to the point where we started shaking involuntarily. My wife looked terrified, and I could see the same despair in her eyes that I felt, that uncomfortable certainty that maybe we really weren't going to leave. Suddenly, the man began to speak in a low voice, almost whispering to the fire, saying that the mountains always take back what is theirs. I tried to understand what he meant, but each word seemed to get lost in the cold. Then he stood up calmly, as if he were in no rush. He looked at us one last time, and that empty smile froze my blood. He walked toward the door, and as he passed the doorknob, the latch moved by itself. The door opened slowly, and he stepped out without saying another word, disappearing into the darkness and leaving only that penetrating cold behind him. As soon as he left, the entire cabin seemed to breathe again, but the cold was still there, seeping into every corner. I ran to the door, but I saw no sign of him. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the snow. I stood there, trying to understand what had just happened, but nothing made sense. My wife, still trembling, came close and suggested we grab our things and leave, even if it was in the middle of the night. That place no longer felt safe, and just the thought of staying there for another second seemed unbearable. We packed everything as fast as we could and left for the car, not even looking back. As we drove down the deserted road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and, for a second, thought I saw someone standing outside the cabin, a motionless shadow, watching. I tried to push the image from my mind, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the cold and fear had messed with us. To this day, we don't talk much about that night. But whenever someone mentions cabins in the mountains, I feel that shiver again, as if winter is still lurking, waiting for the next chance to find us.